Hey internets, one interesting question I sometimes get is what exactly I mean when I say the phrase solipsistic reasoning. And I realize it's actually worth making a video on this, because it's a very common type of reasoning mistake that a lot of people don't really notice. Or they may have a basic idea of what it is, but not really know just how deep this rabbit hole goes. Anyways, it starts with understanding the philosophy of solipsism, and also realizing why it's a little bit of a flawed philosophy, or at least flawed from the perspective of someone who takes it too literally. Solipsism is the epistemology that points out that you can't really be sure of anything outside of the existence of your own mind. Or in other words, you can't actually prove that you are not just dreaming the reality that you are in. You can't actually prove that the people you're interacting with on a day-to-day basis actually have consciousness or quality of their own. You can believe these things, but you can't actually prove it. For example, you cannot prove that you are not a brain in a vat, and that this reality you experience isn't just the matrix being fed to you. There's no way to actually prove that anything you experience outside of your conscious experience of reality is reality. So if the world you live in actually exists, or if you're just in a dream experiencing that world, and the world is simply a projection of your own consciousness, you can't actually empirically prove it. And to some degree, this is true. There's no way to really objectively, fully, 100% prove that the reality you experience is in fact not just a figment of your mind. The problem comes when people actually take it seriously and use this as their main philosophy. That's where you get the literal solipsist. The people who unironically believe that because they cannot prove anything beyond their conscious mind is real, then therefore those things must not be real. This leads to some people believing that they are effectively God, thinking that they have created the world that they experience and everything else is simply an illusion. So they take it to its extreme point and they commit something that I kind of like to refer to as an empiricist fallacy. Or in other words, I cannot measure this, I cannot prove this, therefore it doesn't exist. And the problem with that, of course, is it's not actually very good reasoning. Just because it's technically impossible to prove that anything beyond your conscious mind exists, doesn't mean that that's most likely the reality that you live in. And we can see this with other things pretty commonly. So for example, before we had a way to measure the existence of exoplanets, or planets that exist outside of our solar system, there technically was no way to empirically prove their existence. However, of course, we eventually found a way to prove that they do exist, to the surprise of pretty much no astronomer who knows how to think rationally. Why? Well, it's kinda obvious if you think about it. It'd be really weird for our star to be the only star that has planets going around it. Beforehand, we had no evidence to suggest that our star was some kind of special star that had some kind of magic about it that allowed it to attract planets, or form planets, or whatever, that other stars didn't have. In fact, quite the opposite. If you know your astronomy, you know that our star is relatively common, not the most common type of star. Rather, the sun is a G-type main sequence star. So you can definitely find other stars like this out there. So there was no evidence that the sun had anything unique about it, and thus it wasn't really that surprising when we finally could measure exoplanets. Exciting for astronomers, sure, because they're always excited when they find a new thing, no matter how silly it is, but not very surprising. In fact, most astronomers would have probably been more surprised if we found evidence of the opposite when our technology reached the point where we could actually measure exoplanets. It would actually have been a lot more of a shocking discovery if we found out that no other star out there had planetary celestial bodies orbiting around it except for our sun. But anyway, you might be wondering what the heck this has to do with solipsism. And the answer is that the literal position of being a solipsist kind of runs into the same problem. While it's true you can't actually verify empirically that other people are conscious and that the world is not just simply a product of your imagination, there really isn't much evidence we have that we are that special. For example, I myself tend to have lucid dreams at times, which means a dream that I'm actually aware of the fact that I'm dreaming. And the interesting thing about lucid dreams is that if you're dreaming and you become aware of it, you can actually control the dream. So for instance, you can just summon a hoverboard or something and have fun flying around the world of your dreams while snapping your fingers and making tornadoes appear and things explode. It's actually a lot of fun. So yeah, minor side note, if you don't know how to lucid dream, I recommend looking up how to do it. But the reason I bring this up is that it somewhat serves as evidence to me that the literal interpretation of the solipsistic epistemology is probably not true, because it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense that I'm not able to do the same things when I'm not dreaming. There's no real evidence that I am that special of a piece in this world. And I think that's kind of a big part of growing up and turning into an adult as a human being. It's the realization that you ain't all that. The mature understanding that the world doesn't really seem to revolve around you. So just like we didn't really have any evidence that the sun had anything special about it in terms of being able to have celestial bodies orbiting around it, and thus it wasn't surprising when we were finally able to measure exoplanets and fully verify their existence empirically. It would be be very weird and very unlikely if you were the only person who was truly conscious. And that's probably why the people who actually are solipsists, in the literal sense, and that they actually truly unironically believe that they are God and that they are the only ones that exist, they tend to be a little bit warped. They tend to have some pretty nonsensical perceptions of the world around them. For example, they tend to be very egocentric and oftentimes a little bit immature, and in some cases a little bit psychotic. There's even a few studies out there that confirm that people with solipsistic thinking or solipsistic reasoning have some loose ties to various psychological personality disorders like psychopathy or narcissistic personality disorder. There's definitely overlap there. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. If you literally, legitimately believe that other people weren't real, it suddenly makes sense why psychopaths often treat people like their feelings or their emotions aren't real, or treat people like objects that don't have any rights. Because again, in the worldview of the literal solipsist, the people who push that ideology to the maximum conclusion, thus believing that they are God and that they're the only ones that exist, then of course with that kind of thinking they wouldn't really feel any kind of ethical or moral obligation towards their fellow man in any way. So while solipsism provides an interesting type of philosophy because it's interesting to think about and interesting to ponder, oh yeah, I don't really have a way of proving that anything beyond my own consciousness exists, it can in fact become a problem when people take it too seriously. And what's more interesting though, and this is where the rabbit hole starts to get a little bit deeper, is that there's kind of a gray area in solipsistic thinking. There are a lot of people out there who are actually agnostic towards this kind of thinking. So rather than fully taking the plunge and believing that they are God and that they are the only consciousness that exists in this world, they might instead take an agnostic approach to it, where they're not sure if they're the only person that actually exists. Or perhaps they subconsciously forget that they probably aren't the only person that exists. And so you could call these people solipsist light. They occasionally think this way, but not all the time. And as a result of this, that's where you get solipsistic reasoning. That's where you get these kind of bizarre reasoning errors that stems from them perhaps subconsciously forgetting that they probably aren't the only person on the planet with a consciousness, and that the world probably doesn't revolve around them. And so here's what these errors are. It's actually kind of fun when you learn how to spot them in the wild. You'll realize just how many people struggle with this kind of thinking. And the first of these, it just kind of manifests as people sucking at communication. And not just generally sucking, because honestly, a lot of people suck at communication. I mean sucking at communication in a very specific way. Sucking in a way that they expect other people to have magic knowledge of what they're thinking about. Because someone who might have subconscious level of solipsistic reasoning in their head, they might forget that other people do not possess the same knowledge that they do. They'll think that their vantage point is the only possible vantage point. For example, I had one not exactly the brightest boss back when I was in college, when I was working part-time at a store. And I'm sure we've all met someone like this before. He would make really non-specific requests. One I specifically remember is he would often ask people to get him the ladder. And the problem was, at this job, we had about 20 different ladders in the back room, because this was a warehouse job and there was a bunch of different reasons to use a ladder. And so naturally, when he would ask this question, and he made this mistake over and over and over again, nobody would know what the heck he's talking about. And so one of us would have to ask him, okay, which specific ladder are you asking for? What exactly are you trying to do with this ladder? Because of course, nobody magically knew why he wanted it. And thus nobody knew which one he wanted. And nobody wanted to point this out to him because he would then get very irrationally angry. He would have this kind of narcissistic rage about him whenever anybody asked him to clarify what exactly he was asking for. And so one day I decided to just take one for the team because honestly I didn't care. I was a college kid. I was about to get a better job anyway. So I just took one for us all and kind of sat down with him one day and asked him, you know, this place has hundreds of different shelves with thousands of different items. Why is it you constantly expect us to know which one you want? And his response was something along the lines of just, well, it's obvious what I want. And so I asked him, okay, well, how's it obvious? How would people know what's going on inside your head? We aren't mind readers. And his response was just repeating himself, insisting that it was somehow obvious. And going back and forth on this, I eventually realized that this poor guy legitimately did not understand, could not wrap his little brain around the fact that the thoughts going inside his head were not necessarily the same things as what everybody else was thinking. He genuinely did not understand that the world, the universe, did not revolve around his own consciousness. He genuinely believed that if he thought he wanted something, then everybody else would just magically be on the same page. age. And so that's one example of this kind of solipsistic reasoning. It's a kind of flawed style of reasoning that tends to consequentially stem from solipsistic thinking. And interestingly, I've noticed it tends to be subconscious at times again. And not everybody who thinks this way will consciously claim that they sincerely, fully, truly believe that their mind is the only mind that exists in reality, or that they truly believe that all of reality bends to their will. But subconsciously, they will reason based on this assumption because, again, it's the only mind that they know. And so they find themselves committing these really bizarre, weird reasoning mistakes based on these flawed assumptions. And now, of course, there's also many other reasons someone can be bad at communication. It's not always solipsism. But solipsism is one thing that can cause you to be a bad communicator. If someone just casually forgets the fact that their perspective probably isn't the only perspective in reality, they can easily find themselves in this really silly position where they're just expecting people to, again, possess this magic knowledge of what their perception is. Because at least on a subconscious level, they're having difficulty comprehending in real time that their perception isn't the only real perception. But that's just one way that solipsistic reasoning can show itself. In addition to bad communication stemming from expecting magic knowledge, another example is people who get very irrationally offended by everything. Now, of course, everybody gets offended by some things at times. However, you may notice that there are people out there who just seem to be terminally offended by everything. And one of the things you'll notice from the people who tend to be terminally offended is that it often stems from them assuming that everything they find offensive was directly intended to offend them. Because, of course, certain events and phrases and things going on can always be interpreted in hundreds of different ways. And let's say something can be interpreted 99 ways and one of those ways is offensive. The terminally offended type of solipsist will not only always interpret it in the one way that is offensive, but they will also assume that that one interpretation is the only possible interpretation. Someone said something that could subjectively hurt their feelings, and therefore that is their objective reality. And through the magic of solipsistic reasoning, that is therefore the only reality that exists, and therefore anything that offends them must have been intended to offend them. You said something that hurt their feelings, and therefore you must have intended to hurt their feelings because your interpretation must be the same thing as their interpretation because their interpretation is the only one that exists. And again, it stems from the same type of solipsistic thinking, solipsistic reasoning. This inability to wrap their head around the concept or comprehend in real time that their perception of reality isn't the only perception of reality. And in this case, it's actually kind of sad because it's to their detriment. They're constantly going around thinking that everything that can be interpreted in a way that offends them must have been intended to offend them. And so, of course, they're terminally offended. They're always butthurt and they always think that they're the victim of society. They end up thinking that the world's out to get them or something. It all just feeds into this constant victim mentality. And it just largely, again, stems from them not really understanding that the world probably doesn't revolve around their reality. And this is actually a very common bias that people have, because everyone to some degree is just a little bit solipsistic, because again, we don't really have any evidence against solipsism. And so there's actually a very common cognitive bias that ties into this type of thinking called the spotlight effect. It's this egocentric bias where we tend to assume that the world is constantly looking at us and constantly judging us, and that people are giving us a lot more attention than what we're actually getting, because the world, of course, is always filtered from our conscious understanding of reality. And it's very easy to forget that most people are actually in the exact same boat. In reality, most people probably aren't looking at you. Most people probably don't care about what you're doing. And so you might embarrass yourself in public or something, and then you're still thinking about it 2 days later and worrying about how others are thinking of you, when in reality, most people who saw you embarrass yourself probably forgot about it within a minute, because we're all kind of living in our own little worlds. So people don't actually care. And the terminally offended is just an extreme version of that type of thinking. They don't realize that most likely nobody's actually out to get them or trying to offend them. And this particular type of solipsistic reasoning can also kind of seep into the dating pool as well. For example, the red pill community often calls out female solipsism, but honestly men can do it too sometimes. And it might happen in dating where a man says something that makes a woman feel uncomfortable and she will just assume that he must have intended to make her feel uncomfortable, when in reality he's probably just being awkward and nervous. And so that kind of emotionally driven solipsism can also happen, which is actually kind of a useful part of solipsism to understand, because it makes you realize that you have to pay attention to various signs of how a person is feeling when you're around them. Because a lot of people will assume that you are intending to make them feel that way if you're in a conversation or some social interaction with them. People will often assume that their feelings came from some kind of place of intent, even if they didn't. And so that's actually kind of a useful thing to know if you want to get better at socializing and dating, or even just maintaining healthy relationships that you already have. And the final example I want to talk about is one that you see a bit more often in politics, and that is motive projection. And it happens when somebody assumes that somebody else's motive must be the motive that they think they have, because their perception of what the motive is must be the only perception. It's very circular and very silly. And perhaps it's better I explain this through example again, because one time I said the phrase solipsistic reasoning was back in my video about the January 6th so-called insurrection. And I pointed out that a lot of people were using solipsistic reasoning against the Trump supporters who were there on January 6th at the Capitol riot, and using this kind of reasoning mistake to prove that it must have been an insurrection. And they'll usually do this in response to quite possibly the biggest and simplest piece of evidence that the rioters weren't actually there in an intent to actually carry out a serious insurrection, which is that they all mostly brought protesting signs and Trump-Pence signs instead of AR-15s. It's honestly kind of silly and obvious when you think about it, but people who are actually seriously intending to take part in an armed insurrection against the United States government, specifically Congress, would probably, actually bring some rifles and some serious weaponry, as opposed to what they actually did, which was mostly bringing protest signs and Trump signs and just kind of randomly wandering around inside the building. And heck, most of them didn't even do anything wrong. Most of them were just sort of there. And when you look at the footage of the event, this becomes pretty clear and punches a very big hole in the idea that they were there to actually partake in an insurrection against the United States government. And so what a lot of journalists and a lot of lefty influencers tried to do in response to this, and they said, well, just because they did the insurrection incompetently doesn't mean that they didn't intend for it to be an insurrection. Which is ridiculous reasoning. You could use that to accuse anybody of doing anything. You could legitimately just be standing there outside of a store, and the store owner could come out and accuse you of trying to rob their store, even though you're just standing there. Imagine if you were in that situation and you just pointed out to the store owner, I'm just standing here. And the guy then said, well, just because you're trying to rob the store incompetently doesn't mean you aren't trying to rob it. And so it's a very nonsensical circular argument, an attempt to disconnect the evidence from the context of the situation and then project motive onto you in a way that is completely unfalsifiable. Since there's no way to actually read what's going on in somebody's mind, this means that anybody can always accuse somebody of secretly wanting to do some nefarious act, and technically it can't be proven wrong. And this can also stem from a place of solipsistic reasoning. In some cases, people might genuinely have a difficult time wrapping their head around the fact that just because they think that somebody has a motive doesn't prove that somebody has that motive. They're just asserting that somebody must have that motive because in their mind that's the only motive they could have. It's their reality, therefore it must be the other person's reality as well. So it's entirely solipsistic. That's not how you determine what someone's motives are. You have to look at what they're actually doing, look at the objective evidence, and then try to honestly deduce what a person would most likely be intending to do based on the evidence. You can't just point to a random person on the street and say, stop right there, evildoer. You're clearly trying to do insert bad thing here. Not because of any evidence from what you're doing, but because I think you are, and therefore you are. But that's probably not how reality works. Just because you think that reality is a certain way doesn't mean that reality is a certain way. So the people who made that argument in the January 6th riot in 2021, what they were really doing is just kind of flapping and floundering about because they didn't want to accept the fact that the evidence didn't match their accusation. And so they effectively made an argument where they didn't need to connect the evidence to their accusation because in their mind, their accusation was true because it just was. And that's a very flawed way of thinking. It's solipsistic reasoning. You can't just arbitrarily decide what other people's thoughts are and what their motives are because you just feel like it. Because the world does not revolve around you and reality does not revolve around what you feel to be true. And that, in a nutshell, is the type of bad reasoning that tends to stem from this kind of solipsistic thinking. We human beings have this unfortunate tendency to kind of have an egocentric worldview, or again, the spotlight bias. We tend to assume that our perceptions of reality are true and forget that other people are most likely experiencing reality from a completely different vantage point, with completely different thoughts, through a completely different flow of consciousness. Basically, you have to remember that people are individuals and not necessarily you. And there's actually an interesting word that describes what you can do to kind of prevent yourself from falling into this type of cognitive bias. And that is to sonder. You want to take a step back every now and then and realize that everybody, including strangers passing in the street or in their car or whatever, has a life as complex as your own. There's millions of people out there all experiencing their own story. We're all just constantly trying to live our own lives, and we often forget that everybody else is also doing that, which may sound kind of corny, but it's actually a serious thing that we all need to do. Because if you don't do it, you could easily find yourself falling for these kind of solipsistic styles of thinking. These kind of embarrassingly stupid takes that happen when you occasionally forget that just because you feel a person is thinking a certain way, that's not evidence that they're actually thinking that way. Just because you feel like people should be aware of your thoughts and your opinions Well, the reality is, unless you effectively communicate those thoughts and opinions, people probably don't know and don't care. And especially when it comes to politics, you have to remember that journalists can make any kind of accusation based on some arbitrary claim that somebody's thinking a certain way. And that can just be the journalist's opinion. They don't need to actually have any evidence to back that up, which is just another one of the many reasons why you shouldn't take these people seriously. Anyways, that's all I have to say. Thanks for watching. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and if you like my content and want to support me, you can do so on Ko-Fi, Subscribestar, or by buying some merch. Which, by the way, the Taxation is Theft sale is still going on and will continue to go on until my next High Octane video, which will be my next video, actually. So, relatively soon. But yeah, that is all. Till next time.